From Problems to Solutions, Assumptions and Rationals, Part 2. Now you have produced your solution tree, so it's time to refining your pathways of change, going through your solution tree to see everything is making sense. As you reframe the problems into solutions, you should recheck now all the causal linkages and see if they hold. You should use what we call if and, if then statements to describe the story of change, kind of rehearsing your theory of change. An example, if farmers' technical skills for alternative livelihoods improve and linkages to private sector livelihood opportunities increase and farmers have improved access to credit and men and women are willing to take an investment risk, then we expect to see increased adoption of alternative livelihoods. So this if and then helps you to check if the logical and if the causal logic is holding and if you don't have any problems on your causality chain, if everything is okay. We should check this because it can happen that when you are refining your pathways of change, you come across solutions that you have included inside that in fact are redundant or are expressing other things besides solutions, can be expressing, let's say, indicators. Take a look at the pathway on the left before refining the solution tree. You see that you have there improved nutrition status of women and children under 5 years old, and then you see that this is a pre-solution for enabling reduced prevalence of underweight for women and also reduced prevalence of stunting for children under 5 years old, and this will then lead to an improved food security for vulnerable households. But if you look better, if you think about it, in fact, this reduced prevalence of underweight women and reduced prevalence of stunting for children under 5, they are in fact just indicators of the solution you have given below, improved nutrition status of women and children under 5. So in the course of brainstorming, you have included this reduced prevalence of underweight and stunting by thinking that this would be solutions, when in fact they are just indicators in this example. So you can just take them out and you will not disrupt the logic of your solution tree. You keep them as indicators for the outcome, for the solution, improved nutritional status of women and children under 5. So this is just an example on how you should proceed by using causality from bottom up and top down, so that you can see if you can find redundancies or even wrong outcomes expressed in your pathway, in your solution tree. After you have done this refinement, then is when you start to use the terms outcomes and outputs instead of solutions. We were talking about solutions. In the solution tree, we were talking about problems and underlying causes in the problem tree. Now, when you have, let's say, when you have finished your solution tree, now we start moving towards the theory of change tree or graphic, and instead of talking about solutions, we'll start to talk about outcomes and outputs. It can happen that you come across with something that we call breakthrough, which is a change that represents quite a significant leap forward or an advance on the pathway of change that is not easily or, let's say, quickly reversed. For example, improved literacy or changes in norms, changes in national policy or investment by the government to increase extension services, or changes in attitudes and beliefs that lead to improved outcomes. These breakthroughs are often a precondition for multiple outcomes at the next level. The breakthrough that we have seen here, positive change in gender roles and norms, is shown in a different color and shape than other preconditions. So you can do the same if you find that you have found a breakthrough, and you can isolate that one in your theory of change graphic. You don't need to forcefully find breakthroughs. It's just an example of what could be an interesting cornerstone of your solution. So now you're changing your problem tree into solutions. And this is what you should do in a nutshell, right? You have the graphic representations of a problem tree, and the solution tree should mirror this problem tree. All solutions should be stated as results. A pathway of change illustrates the series of incremental changes that, when taken together as a set, are sufficient to achieve a domain of change. A theory of change tree or diagram or graphic, as you want to call it, may have to stretch onto several pages, and we have seen that you have several solutions for connecting them if necessary. So this is basically what we have discussed until now, and then we can also refine these pathways of change where a solution tree then begins to transform into a theory of change diagram, when you have then everything then reviewed so that you can go to the last steps of the theory of change diagram. Some very summarized group work instructions for you to develop a solution tree. So now you reframe the overarching problem as a goal for the solution tree. You reframe the key problems as domains of change. You reframe all problems as solutions. And all should be stated as results. This is an important aspect. Don't forget. Don't forget as well the what, the where, and the who. This is also an important issue when you are expressing your solutions, the statements about your solutions. Try also to clearly identify the groups who are disproportionately affected by the problem in the result statement. If you have vulnerable groups, express them also in your problem tree. Should also highlight gender issues to express gender sensitiveness or responsive of the project of your solution tree. Where you have gender inclusiveness, how do you express your statements? Always include men, women, girls, and boys. Include expressions that facilitate the reviewer to understand that you are having a gender perspective on your project. Distill the pathways of change to essential outcomes. That's what I've said before. Take redundancies out. Check for solutions that may actually be indicators or outputs. Move those outputs then below the tree. Identify breakthroughs if it's possible, if you have them. If not, it's okay. Recheck all the causal linkages and logic from top down, bottom up. Everything must be logical. You must have a causal chain of change. Check for systemic knowledge or skill-related and behavioral outcomes. Try to identify them as such, and continue to document all the evidence gaps that you don't have related to these outcomes. Important thing is to keep the problem tree up to date. The next step of your theory of change graphic is now to include assumptions and rationals. And these are the learning objectives of today's lecture, in fact. So we need to identify conditions, which are assumptions, we call them assumptions, conditions that are needed, important for the success of the theory of change, or at least some portion of it, meaning that maybe you don't have to have conditions identified in all the pathways of change, but you need to identify them where they are important for the success of the theory of change. These conditions or assumptions are issues that are outside of the project's control. The project has no power on changing them, but expects that somehow they are not a risk that constrains the project flow. Another thing that you need to determine are facts or informations, also called rationals, that help you explaining why a precondition or a set of preconditions is necessary and sufficient to ensure an outcome. These are in fact explanations about the causality chain that is inherent to one of the pathways that you are describing. Assumptions and rationals explain the underlying logic behind our expectations of the connections between different components of the pathway of change. They represent a set of, let's say, beliefs that guide decisions and ideally should be supported by scientific research, best practices, or expert knowledge. Assumptions should tell the story about how and why planners expect change to occur as depicted in your outcomes framework. So it is your story. Why do we have this causality chain that should better help the donors or help the readers to explain why your change is going to happen? Assumptions can draw on theory from academic research or practice, and their articulation is particularly important where the success of an intervention relies on often complex and sometimes poorly understood relationships between, for example, the social and ecological systems. So you can refer to the assumptions to better explain how different outputs can unfold into outcomes and how these outcomes can unfold into further outcomes, etc., etc. So the assumptions to justify this transition between the outcomes are very important stones for the understanding of your project. Assumptions can as well be expressed as well as conditions that already exist and that we expect will remain in place during the duration of the project cycle, meaning that the project is counting on these conditions to remain in the course of the project and after. Some examples: annual flooding in the project area will not exceed 10-year flood level, otherwise the project efforts would not be successful. Government agricultural extension workers turnover rate remains stable, meaning that you have enough personnel on the extension services to be capacitating our farmers, or economic condition remains favorable for private sector investments, meaning that credit interest rates will not go up very high so that economic conditions remain favorable. So these are all statements that are plausible for assumptions and that could be useful for you to make your own ideas on how to express your own assumptions. There are some common assumption pitfalls that you may come across and that we've seen in some projects when you may state an assumption that in fact the information or the data you have shows to be untrue. In this case, improved access to quality primary health care and nutrition services unfolds the change to increase adoption of beneficial infant and young child feeding practices by caregivers, men and female, of children under 2. You can formulate an assumption for this transition as that you are assuming that adequate trained health staff is in place. But in fact, this is a mistake because this was originally the precondition of inadequate quality health care and nutrition services. So your project has changed this condition, and now you have adequate trained staff, and that's why you have improved access to quality primary health care and nutrition services, and that's why you have now increased adoption of beneficial infant and young child feeding. This was not an exemption, but it was a precondition. It was an underlying cause that your project has solved, in fact. It also can happen that you are just restating the outcome to an outcome link. You have an outcome which says reduced farming on marginal lands, and this contributes to a reduced destruction of marginal lands. And then you have an assumption that where you say this is only possible if households stop farming on marginal lands, and then only then there will be less destruction. So you are in fact just rephrasing, restating the outcome before, which is reduced farming on marginal land. So this is redundant. It is not an assumption. Much better assumptions here would be that, let's say, climatic conditions remain stable in the next decade. You have enough rainfall in the next decade. Our government continues to commit resources for the extension services on providing soil and water conservation measures. So all of these two would be much more appropriate assumptions than that one that is just restating the outcome before. You need also to be clear about what you mean in your assumptions. Government will commit human resources. This type of statement as an assumption, this is not enough. You need to have the evidence. Will it or will it not commit human resources? Will, this verb will, is the wrong formulation for your assumption. Adequate post-harvest storage facilities exist to absorb increased production. Do they exist or don't they exist? You cannot give the opportunity for questioning your assumption. Your assumption must be formulated as a clear and concise statement that is specific and allows people to infer about the risk that the project is incurring to. Much better formulations will be that government continues to commit human resources, or adequate post-harvest storage facilities remain in place to absorb increased production. These are different verb usages that express a much more concrete statement about the risk that is being taken. You can also add information to your theory of change, to your theory of change narrative about all these assumptions. Where do you get the information that adequate post-harvest storage facilities will remain in place? Where can we search for this information? If possible, it should be added to the theory of change narrative. Another pitfall is when we include assumptions, we include factors in assumption that should be within the reach of the project, that should in fact be a target of the project. When men and women are willing to take investment risk, this cannot be an assumption, or men and women will be open to new practices. Your project must contribute that to the degree of openness and willingness of people. This will rest on the success of the project intervention and are not assumptions. These should be consequences. These are outcomes of the project and not assumptions. Some more examples on pitfalls and weak and strong assumptions. Let us look at this here. Reduced farming on marginal lands will reduce destruction of agricultural lands. And the assumption, condition for this to happen is that alternative farming lands are available. This is a weak formulation. You should find out if they are or not available. You should rephrase this to, if you would rephrase this to alternative farmlands remain available, you would express that you know that these lands are there already, so they will remain available, and the project can count on this. And if they remain available, then the reduced destruction of agricultural lands can be achieved. And if not, if land is not available, then you need to review the causality chain. Can reduced farming on marginal lands be achieved without this condition, without this in place? That's the question you should have asked. Another assumption that increased integration of traditional practices will reduce reliance on non-adapted varieties, and this can be achieved if farmers are motivated to integrate practices. This is a weak formulation because it's again another example of those assumptions misformulated that express things that should be in fact in the realm of the project influence. The project should have taken care of motivating the farmers for integrating practices. This is in fact a precondition that should be achieved by the project. It should be an outcome of the project. Female-headed farming households have sufficient labor available to implement measures. This is again a weak formulation. It should be better formulated. We should find out what the time burden is. This will be critical to adoption of the technologies and has implications for the project intervention design. So it's again a weak assumption. You should try to formulate this in a better way so that the risk of time constraints is better expressed in your project theory of change tree. The other assumption here, pest infestation or plant disease remain within normal limits during the project time frame and beyond. So this is a strong formulation of an assumption. This is a good assumption. And so improved soil fertility will lead to increased crop production only if pest infestation or plant diseases remain within normal limits. And you could complement this statement of the assumption in your theory of change narrative with more details and more data on what are the limits that are mentioned here. 3 wrong formulated or weak formulated assumptions and only 1 strong formulated assumption as an example here for you for better understanding. And how do you insert assumptions in your theory of change model? So in your graphic, you can make such indications in your graphic with such boxes where you can have the assumption formulated or as a statement, or you can have only an indication that you're talking here about formulation A1, for example. And then we have a table that explains this assumption in more detail. So you have for each part of your theory of change tree or graphic, you have an indication that there an assumption is needed so that we understand better how the outcomes are going to unfold and what is the inherent risk of achieving that outcome. Rationals are dealt with in a similar fashion, so you also include some boxes where you have then, let's say R1 will be referring to rational 1, and rationals, they help to explain the underlying logic, provide, let's say, evidence about why these outcomes are necessary so that other outcomes can be achieved. It's needed for those linkages that where the causal logic is not so obvious. So you can make a small reference in, like I said, in the theory of change tree with some boxes, and then you can have this explanation about the rational in another table in which I'm going to show some examples afterwards. So reduced prevalence of gender-based violence, they are a cause of increased birth weight problems. And this may not be so obvious from many of the readers, so you would need a rationale that explains this, and this rationale is based on some scientific evidence, and you can even make reference to this scientific evidence. After you have indicated the assumptions and the rationals in some boxes in your theory of change tree, you can have them on such a table like this one, where you explain the assumption in more detailed form, more detailed formulations, and you can even have indication about the references where you're getting this information, the evidence base for this assumption. You can have some literature, some reports where you are basing your assumption. The same for the rationals. So summarizing, assumptions, they highlight these conditions that you need to explain the donor or explain your agency. They are important to the success of your theory of change or some portion of it. You don't need to have assumptions everywhere, but these assumptions, they are outside of the project's control. They are some risk that the project is in fact taking. Rationals, on the other hand, they help explaining the underlying cause and provide evidence about the causality, why outcomes in the pathway are necessary for achieving other outcomes that are above them. So this is important for helping to understand the causality behind your theory of change tree. Like I said, you don't need an assumption rational on every causal linkages. You need them there where they are important, when you think that they are important, when there is a pertinent risk that the project is taking. So you need some conditions need to be in place so that the project can be successful, or in those connections, in those linkages where the understanding of the change is not that clear, so you need a rationale to explain that better. You can use different colors to shape all these boxes from assumptions and rationals. You can be imaginative regarding these issues so that you have a colorful theory of change tree. So you should start with one pathway of change and check for the assumptions between each precondition and the outcomes above them. You should insert these assumptions in the diagram like I've showed you before, and then you can document them in such a table or so-called matrix. The same for the rationals, of course. So that's all what I wanted to say to you about assumptions and rationals. So, and with that, we are already moving forward into our theory of change. So the theory of change narrative will use the mind map, the theory of change graphic that you have produced, and also address all these assumptions and rationals for better explaining your theory of change. So that's the whole purpose about having not only this mind map, but also having these assumptions expressing the risks that the project is incurring, and also all these rationals that help you then to formulate a narrative that is understandable for everybody. Thank you very much and see you soon.